Welcome back to the Bible Reading Challenge podcast. My name is Aaron Ventura, and in this episode, we're going to look at the book of Jeremiah. You can find a written version of this episode along with a bunch of other resources over at localchristendom.com. And if you have questions or other feedback, you can email me at aaronventura@gmail.com. Jeremiah is the longest book in the English Bible. Although Psalms and Isaiah have more chapters, in terms of its actual word count, Jeremiah tops them all. One of the things that makes Jeremiah such a difficult book to get a hold on is how the material is organized. Jeremiah's prophecies are not arranged in a strict chronological order, and many of his oracles are undated, which makes the historical context a little bit more ambiguous. However, there is a general flow to the book, but it takes some time and attention to notice it. In general, the first 45 chapters are aimed at Judah, and then chapters 46 to the end of the book are addressed to foreign nations. The book could also be outlined into 7 sections with a historical appendix at the end. We could also throw in Lamentations as a sort of second appendix, since it has traditionally been attributed to Jeremiah. The first 12 chapters record Jeremiah's call to ministry, and it's followed by some introductory oracles against God's backsliding people. Chapters 13 to 20 are a collection of messages about Judah's exile and suffering, along with the command from the Lord for Jeremiah not to marry or have children, because those who are living are going to die gruesome deaths. In chapters 21 to 29, we get a series of dated messages that contain important information about Israel's future. 70 years of desolation are decreed in Jeremiah 25, and if Israel wants to survive, they must submit themselves to the yoke of Babylon and go submissively into exile. Not only should they submit to Babylon, but they should dwell there, build houses, have children, and seek the peace of the city. If they do this, after 70 years, God promises a return from exile. At the center of the book, chapters 30 to 33, are messages of hope, as God promises to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. After this, there are 2 more dated messages in chapters 34 to 35, and then chapters 36 to 45 are an extended narrative of Jeremiah's life. This narrative section is bookended by 2 scenes with Jeremiah's scribe Baruch. In the opening scene, Baruch is told to write down all of Jeremiah's prophecies, and in the closing scene, Jeremiah gives him a personal oracle to not seek personal greatness in these days of judgment. The 7th and final section of Jeremiah is chapters 46 to 51. This is a series of oracles against foreign nations, starting with Egypt and ending with Babylon. Since most of the book has portrayed Babylon as this invincible force of judgment, it is a surprising twist at the end that Babylon will also have a dramatic fall. Knowing this glimpse into the future gives new light and perspective on everything we just read. We may not understand God's ways, but all his ways are just. In the final verses of the book, Jehoiachin, the former king of Judah, is released from prison and elevated to dine at the king's table. This is a flicker of hope in the dark, the equivalent of seeing the words "to be continued" flash across the screen at the end of a movie. This is a scene that tells us a sequel is coming. All right, well, let's talk now about the historical context of Jeremiah, because this is probably one of the sections in biblical history that is most unfamiliar to us, and there's a lot going on during this time period. So let's start with talking about biblical cosmology. And cosmology is just kind of your vision, your view of the world. Well, in biblical cosmology, Jerusalem was the center of the world. Israel was a priestly nation that was meant to mediate God's blessings to everyone else. So just as Adam represented all of mankind in the garden, Israel and its priesthood represented all the nations before God. This is evident especially in the sacrificial offering of 70 bulls, one for each of the 70 nations, during the Feast of Tabernacles. So Zechariah 14 actually describes some of the consequences of refusing to keep this feast. It says, "And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain." That's Zechariah 14, 16 to 17. This meant that when Jerusalem herself did not worship the king, the rest of the world suffered along with her. So famine, drought, all kinds of calamity came upon the earth. As the Apostle Peter says, judgment begins at the house of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel of God? So the book of Jeremiah includes warnings for Israel and Judah, but also for Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Damascus, Kedar, Hazor, Elam, and finally Babylon as well. When God is done using Babylon as his hammer to judge the whole world, Babylon will be shattered by Persia. This is a fulfillment of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2, wherein he sees 4 successive empires. Babylon is the gold head, Medo-Persia is the silver arms and chest, Greece is the bronze belly and thighs, and then Rome is the legs of iron mixed with Jewish clay. The rise of Babylon inaugurates this age of empires, as God forsakes and destroys his holy temple and sets up a new world order that will culminate with the coming of Christ's kingdom. So Jeremiah is prophesying on the precipice of this cosmic shift in the way that God is governing the world. No longer is his throne and dwelling place in Jerusalem. God says to Jeremiah in the opening chapter, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordained you a prophet to the nations." So who was Jeremiah? Who was this prophet? Well, the ministry of Jeremiah runs from around 627 BC to 586 BC, which is a 40-plus year ministry. And his ministry spans the reign of 5 different Judean kings. So there's Josiah, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah. And you could read 2 Kings 22 to 25 and 2 Chronicles 34 to 36 to get this historical context for his prophecies. And I'd highly recommend that you do that. We are told in the opening verses that Jeremiah was called to the ministry in the 13th year of King Josiah's reign. Now, Josiah was just an 8-year-old boy when he became king. But he sought the Lord as a teenager, around 16 years old, and then at 20 years old, in the 12th year of his reign, it says he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the wooden images, the carved images, and the molded images. And so he did in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and all around with axes. So under King Josiah, both Israel and Judah are actually united for the first time since the days of Solomon. The northern kingdom had fallen to Assyria 100 years prior, but as Nahum prophesied, Assyria would decline, they would be conquered by Babylon, and then the 10 northern tribes were reconquered as idolatry was vanquished in the cities. So it is right after this cleansing of the land and tribal reunion that God calls Jeremiah to be his prophet. We don't know for sure how old Jeremiah was when God called him, but we're told that he was a youth, which almost certainly means he was under the age of 20, probably a young teenager. So God begins a reformation in Judah through a 20-year-old King Josiah and a young teenage prophet in Jeremiah. Jeremiah was also a Levite from the priestly line of Aaron, and there is a long history of the high priesthood that actually manifests itself in this book. So, for example, Jeremiah will have a showdown in the temple with a rival prophet-priest named Hananiah. You can see that in chapter 28. But to understand the significance of this interchange, we need to go back to the beginning of the Aaronic priesthood. So this is going to be sort of a historical aside on the history of the high priesthood, so take it for what it's worth. Moses' brother Aaron was the first high priest in Israel, and we are told that he had 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Now, Aaron's first 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, they were killed for offering strange fire before the Lord. You can see that in Leviticus 10. Since Eleazar was the next oldest son, the office of high priest passed to him after Aaron's death. After Eleazar, his son Phinehas became high priest, and it appears that this pattern continued for a time where the Eleazar line from Aaron possessed the high priesthood. However, something happened during the period of the judges, we don't know what, such that by the time we get to 1 Samuel, Eli is high priest, but he is from the line of Ithamar, the other brother. Now Eli had 2 sons named Hophni and Phinehas, and they were evil, and so God pronounces judgment on the house of Eli, saying, "In one day they shall die, both of them. Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before my anointed forever." Fast forward a few generations, and this prophecy gets fulfilled in the days of Solomon. Abiathar, who is David's high priest and in the line of Ithamar, conspired with Joab and Adonijah against David, and for this reason he was deposed. So 1 Kings 2:27 says, "So Solomon removed Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, that he might fulfill the word of the Lord which he spoke concerning the house of Eli at Shiloh." Zadok then replaces Abiathar, and so the high priesthood shifts back from the Ithamar line back to the Eleazar line. Now, you might ask, what does this have to do with Jeremiah? Well, when Abiathar is deposed by Solomon, instead of being put to death, he says this to him, "Go to Anathoth, to your own fields, for you are deserving of death, but I will not put you to death at this time, because you carried the ark of the Lord God before my father David, and because you were afflicted every time my father was afflicted." Well, the book of Jeremiah begins with this identification. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth, in the land of Benjamin. So Jeremiah is a priest from the Ithamar side, and he is going to confront Hananiah, who is a priest on the Eleazar side. So there's this continued pattern in the history of the high priesthood that when the priestly line goes bad, it gets transferred to the other brother. It is noteworthy then that the book of Jeremiah ends with the death of Sariah, the high priest, and he's going to be the last to minister in Solomon's temple. So as you read Jeremiah, remember that he is a young priest with an unpopular prophetic message. He's going to face opposition from the most powerful people in Jerusalem, as God says to him, "For behold, I have made you this day a fortified city and an iron pillar, and bronze walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, against its princes, against its priests, and against the people of the land. They will fight against you, but they shall not prevail against you, for I am with you, says the Lord, to deliver you." All right, well, there's your historical aside on the high priesthood. Let's get back to the context of Jeremiah. So 5 years after Jeremiah was called to the ministry, Hilkiah the high priest discovers the book of the law. After Josiah hears the contents of the book, he tears his clothes. He realizes that God's wrath lies heavy upon the nation, and so he gathers all the people to the temple. And then Josiah reads them that book of the covenant, and he renews that covenant before the Lord. Now, in one sense, this is great and glorious. There is a recovery, this discovery of God's word, and you might think that this is going to be the event that saves the nation from destruction. But as you will notice as you read Jeremiah, there is this recurring charge of backsliding. So at one point, God says, "Backsliding Israel has shown herself more righteous than treacherous Judah." Despite Josiah's purge of idolatry on the high places, sin has not been purged from the people's hearts. Instead of the covenant bringing blessings and freedom to the nation, their backsliding only increases the curses that are going to fall on them. After the death of Josiah, the last righteous king, Judah goes through 4 wicked kings who consistently rebel against the word of the Lord. It is helpful to note that anytime you come across an oracle that is dated to the time of King Josiah, the context there is going to be one of reformation. They have reestablished on paper and by covenant the law of God in the land, but they continue to break it. All the oracles that are given during the reigns of the other kings are in a post-Reformation context. By this time, the disease that was in the body has now spread to the head, the king, and so that head is going to be cut off. 2 of the kings only reigned for 3 months. At the same time that Jeremiah was prophesying in Jerusalem, the prophets Zephaniah and Habakkuk were also active. Ezekiel and Daniel were born, and they were likely trained by Jeremiah. About halfway through Jeremiah's ministry, Daniel is taken off into Babylon, and he rises to the highest command next to King Nebuchadnezzar. This helps explain why Jeremiah was singled out by Nebuchadnezzar and set free when Babylon came to destroy the city. You can see that in chapter 39. Daniel had been interceding for the righteous back in Babylon and preparing a place for them to flourish even in exile. However, Jeremiah chooses to remain in Jerusalem after its destruction to help Gedaliah govern the people who were left behind. But it is not long before Gedaliah gets assassinated by Ishmael, then Ishmael is killed by Johanan, and then Johanan drags Jeremiah with them back to Egypt. After this, we don't know what happened to Jeremiah. But his life portrays a reversal of the Exodus, as he is taken from the promised land, from the temple, from the center of the universe, and is hauled off into the wilderness and back to Egypt. But in so doing, Jeremiah will fulfill his ministry, as the Lord said at his ordination, "Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. See, I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant." Let's close with just a couple suggestions for reading Jeremiah. So the first suggestion is to look for the parallels between Jeremiah and other biblical characters that you know and can think of. So I'll just give you one example. The Apostle Paul is very similar to Jeremiah. Both lived and ministered in the years leading up to the destruction of the temple. Both prophesied and bore witness before kings and priests and the highest powers in the land. Both bookend the age of what we call the oikumene. That's the age of the four empires foretold in the book of Daniel. So Jeremiah prophesied at the beginning when Babylon, the gold head, arose. And then Paul, he prophesies during the reign of Rome, the fourth empire, that was struck by the stone of the fifth empire, which is Christ's kingdom. Both Jeremiah and Paul were unmarried, although I believe Paul was a widower. Both were persecuted and left for dead. Both had long and at times very lonely ministries. Both were prophets to the nations. Of course, many of these parallels apply to Jesus as well. Jesus asks his disciples in Matthew 16, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." So even the first century Jews saw parallels between Jesus and Jeremiah. So think about those connections as you read this book. My second suggestion is to just constantly ask yourself, what is the historical context here? Remember that, write it down. I mean, go onto the website, go to Local Christendom and see the charts that I've put there, the timeline. That will help you just orient to these oracles that are happening that can feel at times very repetitive. So it takes some time, but do the reading of 2 Kings 22 to 25 and 2 Chronicles 34 to 36 and read that until you know that history inside and out. We spent a good amount of time in this podcast talking about this historical background, so maybe listen to it now, but then go back and listen to this again after you finish the book. Go and retrace your steps. All right, well, that is the book of Jeremiah, and if you need a little more motivation to go and do some of that historical research, digging around, reading in Kings and Chronicles, just remember that this is going to be the same context for some of the other prophetic books, including Ezekiel, which we're going to look at next. So it will be well worth it. All right, that's all for this week. Until next time, keep on reading.